Hi friends, my name is Robert Mealy. I'm the orchestra director of the Boston Early Music Festival, and I'm also the director of the historical performance program here at the Juilliard School. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the program that you're going to be hearing with Philippe Jaroussky, and this interesting world that we rarely get to see, that of the opera seria and the repertory for the spectacular singers that were involved in this genre. This was actually one of the most popular art forms in the 18th century. It was spectacular, it was universal, you heard it all over Europe, but this is also a repertory that most of us really have never experienced. We know Handel's operas, of course, but he is about the only composer out of a huge cast of international superstars who made this admittedly unlikely form into the must-see fashionable entertainment of every major city in Europe, and even beyond, with opera seria being done as far east as St. Petersburg. It's a very curious art form. Today we mostly think of it, quite rightly, as a vehicle for the bravura display of spectacular performers, the castrati, who were the highest paid artists of their day. But ironically, opera seria, or as the 18th century knew it, drama in musica, was actually created as a chaste reform to the excesses of the 17th century operas. Now this all began in what was called the Arcadian Academy of Rome. This was an offshoot of Queen Christina of Sweden, her musical entourage in Rome. Here, in a kind of self-created poetic Arcadia, these intellectuals and poets put forward new ideals. They thought that poets should return to the simplicity and directness of antique drama in creating these new operas. Unlike the sprawling, chaotic plots of Cavalli and his colleagues, which are filled with bawdy nurses, stuttering hunchbacks, sketchy heroes. Now, these new operas would be on noble themes from history, stories that would make you a better person. And their language was similarly elevated. Arias were now elegant similes or metaphors, and the da capo structure of these arias allow the character and the audience a moment to reflect on the intense emotions that they're going through. Now, the structure of these opera seria, or these drama in musica, were arranged so that there would be something like 25 arias. There are a lot of them, and they're all properly distributed among the 6 or so characters. The main characters get the most, and gradually going down in order of importance until the advisor or the confidant usually just gets 1 or 2 arias. And these arias are all strategically placed to allow most of the characters reasonable exits from stage after their big number. Now, this is a complicated matrix, and only a few librettists managed to work with these strict literary requirements and these very equally strict theatrical conventions to produce something that was actually really dramatic. Everyone agreed that the librettist who came the closest to realizing this ideal was the great Metastasio, and who was a product of this Roman Arcadian scene. He was actually born Pietro Trapassi, but early on he found mentors who gave him an excellent classical education, translated his name to Greek from Trapassi to Metastasio, and then left him a fortune when they died. So it was really not a bad start for a writer. Metastasio wrote 27 libretti over the course of his career, and these libretti were set literally hundreds of times. They were enjoyed not only for their drama, but also for their poetry. So they were published as well and read privately. His opera libretti went in over 200 editions were published during the 18th century. So he was immensely famous, immensely well-read. Everyone knew these pieces, and they knew them very, very well because they had seen them being set by dozens of composers over their opera-going lifetime. Now, of course, it's very rare for a full opera seria to be staged today, of course, with the exception of Handel, and I think that's because a lot of these works a lot of the people who set Metastasio and libretti were composers who we simply don't recognize today, like Ferrandini or Piccinni, that starts getting into that game of, is it a pasta or is it a composer? These are fascinating composers, but they're really not on most of our spectrum of musical history. So this is a corner of music that we really don't think about all that much. We usually think Handel and Bach, Haydn and Mozart, and in between this vague sort of gray area. But in fact, this language was the most popular language throughout Europe in the 18th century, the language of the opera seria. So one way we come to know it today is by programs like what Philippe has done, a vehicle for a spectacular singer, putting together various arias from all these different productions, which are wonderful in that you can see different sides of Philippe's amazing abilities, but also because you can see different sides of this great artwork. So the second half of Artaserse's program tonight features the familiar names of Handel and Vivaldi, but the first half I find very interesting. We're thrown into this world of unfamiliar opera superstars. Now, one of the things I really find fascinating about the whole opera seria scene is how very, very specific it is musically. So many of these operas were set on Metastasio libretti. They're all written for the same small crew of brilliant Italian castrati, these virtuosi who traveled throughout Europe. They all knew each other. It's a very, very, very small scene. The composers knew each other. The singers knew the composers very, very, very closely. But also, it's an art form, as I mentioned, that was totally international in its audience and sometimes in its composers. So you have this very, very localized creation, really out of the Venetian and the Neapolitan conservatories that forms this art form that's heard throughout Europe. It dominates the scene in Europe. A good example of this is the overture that starts our concert tonight. That's by a Venetian, Zanetto Ferrandini, who later changes his name to Giovanni Battista Ferrandini, a little more elegant. He was trained at one of these Venetian conservatories before finding his way as a teenager to Munich, where he first worked as an oboist, a sign of the training that you would get in the Ospedale in Venice. Ferrandini gradually made his way up the ladder of the court, and by 1753 he's actually creating the opera to open Munich's spectacular Residenztheater, which is, when you go to Munich, you absolutely have to see this. It's built by Cuvier. It's like the perfect example of Rococo architecture. And it's a perfect visual analog for the ornate music that's coming off the stage. This is an entire world for itself and of itself. Now, where Ferrandini brought his Venetian training to Munich, the next composer we hear, Johann Adolf Hasse, was actually moving in the opposite direction. Hasse was born near Hamburg. He got his first training working at the Hamburg Opera Company, just as Handel had 20 years earlier. And very much like Handel, he soon moved down to Italy to figure out what this Italian style was all about. Now you have to remember that there are no CDs, there's no real way to figure out this new international style without actually going to Italy. You might hear it in a great opera house, but Hamburg was actually a bit of a backwater in that regard. The Hamburg opera was entirely German, it used German singers, so you wouldn't have heard these great Italian singers or the latest in Italian style. So he goes down to Italy, and unlike Handel, he kind of goes native. He stays there for 6 years, he converts to Catholicism, which is a big deal for a Lutheran, and while he's there, in these 6 years, he writes 7 opera seria and 8 intermezzi for Naples. So he's immensely productive. And thanks to this immersion in the Neapolitan opera scene, he develops an international reputation very quickly, especially after his setting of Metastasio's Artaserse, which was a huge hit at the 1730 Venice Carnival. In fact, 2 arias from this production became part of Farinelli's repertory for many, many years thereafter. In fact, these 2 arias were used when Farinelli gets employed by King Philip V of Spain to help him cure his deep melancholia, what we call depression today. Farinelli had to sing 2 arias from Act 2 of Hasse's Artaserse to him every night for a decade to help him with his depression. The court of Saxony actually lured Hasse away from Italy, having seen this production of Artaserse, and the Saxon king gave him and his wife, the amazing soprano Faustina Bordoni, a luxurious salary with plenty of time off to travel and do productions elsewhere. We hear some arias from Demofonte, which is a Metastasio libretto that Hasse said in 1748 for Dresden, and his wife is singing the prima donna role of Dircea. I mention this because in the recit you'll hear the title character actually addresses Dircea. The title role of Demofonte was itself created for the great castrato Cariastini, who was about 44 at the time. After his first big successes in Italy, he starts going on the international circuit. He made his debut back in Rome in 1721 when he was 17, and he was a great example of immaculately polished singing. Hasse himself said, "Those who have not heard Caristini have not heard the most perfect style of singing." And according to Quantz, who really grew up in the Dresden Opera House scene, he thought that Caristini had extraordinary virtuosity in brilliant passages and spectacular breath control. And this might be a moment to speak a little bit about what we know of how the castrati sang. Of course, this is a sound we'll never hear today. It was a phenomenal sound by all accounts. They had enormous lung capacity, they had brilliant technique, and they had incredible, they could project very well. There's always these stories about them competing with trumpeters to see how long and how brilliantly they could hold a note. But we do know something about their delivery. We can reconstruct this from treatises like Tosi, who wrote his Opinioni dei cantori antichi e moderni, which was translated in the 18th century as wonderful translation, Observations on the Florid Song or Sentiments on the Ancient and Modern Singers. This becomes a real Bible of singing instruction. And Tosi talks a great deal about a couple of things. He talks about how you must perfect your trill. In fact, you must perfect many different kinds of trills. He gives 8 different possibilities. Trills that start slow and fast, that start fast and slow, short, long, various colors of trills, and he also talks about where to ornament them properly, where to put the crucial appoggiatura, which is something that he goes into chapters and chapters about. Most interestingly for me, Tosi talks about passaggi, what we now think of as coloratura, and the qualities of passaggi, of these brilliant passages, should be the following. It should be perfettamente intonato, so perfectly in tune. The notes should be battuto, that is beaten, and granito, or distinct. And they also need to be eguale, they're equal, they're not, there's no messiness there. And interestingly, rotto, or broken, and of course, veloce, or fast. So the imperative virtue was accuracy and clarity and brilliance. On the one hand, that's for fast notes. But then, on the other hand, the other imperative was sheer beauty of sound and control of the shape of the phrase. And in this, the importance of what's called the messa di voce, or the sending of the voice, was crucial. This is something that both instrumentalists and vocalists practiced incessantly. In fact, the great violinist Tartini recommended that violinists should practice their messa di voce for 1 hour every day, just 5 minutes at a time. But still, you have to devote an hour to that. I haven't done that yet today, but I'm about to. One interesting thing about Hasse's immensely elegant style is that it's really perfectly suited to Metastasio's poetry, and so much so that Charles Burney, the great writer about music, later remarked how this poet, that is Metastasio, and musician, Hasse, are really 2 halves of what, like Plato's androgyne, once constituted a whole, for as they're equally possessed of the same characteristic marks of true genius, taste, and judgment, so propriety, consistency, clearness, and precision are alike the companions of both. Hasse may, without injury to his brethren, be allowed to be as superior to all other lyric composers as Metastasio is to all other lyric poets. Now, it's interesting he uses the word lyric because this really is at the heart of this art. This is really the musical language that today we call gallant. It's balanced, it's uncomplicated, and above all, it prizes melodic shape above harmonic complexity. Interestingly, Burney also says that there were 2 great revolutions in music during the 17th and 18th century, and the first one is Monteverdi, when he invents the stile moderno. We all know about that today. But interestingly, he says the second revolution was in Naples with composers like Leonardo Vinci, and that revolution was to liberate melody from harmonic complexity. So that's what the real art of this is. Like Metastasio's poetry, it looks very easy, but it's very hard to pull off, to create what Leopold Mozart calls il filo, or the melodic thread that links together these beautiful small gestures into a musical sentence that is very touching. Next we turn to a real Italian this time, Piccinni, who was a product of the Neapolitan conservatories. He grew up there, he was trained in them like Hasse, and like Hasse, he created not only opera seria, but also opere buffe. He's a bit later than Hasse. He starts writing operas in the 1750s, and his first big success is on a Metastasio libretto. In 1756, he sets Zenobia at the Teatro San Carlo in Naples, a huge opera house, and that becomes a big thing. We'll hear an aria from his setting of Catone in Utica, another Metastasio libretto, which was first performed in Mannheim at the Hoftheater there in 1770. So also gives you a sense of just how long this genre of opera seria lasts. If Bernie is saying the first revolution of this music in the 18th century happens in the 1710s or 1713, now it's going all the way right into 1770 and 1780. And in fact, it really is, in many ways, it plants the seeds for what becomes what we know as the classical style of Haydn and Mozart. Now, one of the things that Neapolitan education system taught all these composers was to write immensely fluently and immensely fast. The whole training there was in partimento, a kind of figured bass, which taught you the basic building blocks, the basic gestures of harmonic progressions that you could use in different ways, reassemble them in various ways. And they also learned solfeggio, which is the same but with melody, the basic building blocks of phrase structure and how to create a beautiful and eloquent melody. This means that they have this massive vocabulary of ready-made harmonic and melodic templates that can be fitted together very quickly and very easily. It's kind of IKEA or Lego of music. But the result is extremely beautiful and extremely polished. And this is how, for example, Piccinni could manage to set 2 full opera serie and 6 opere buffe, also full-night entertainments, in 1770, before he sets Catone in November. So he's created 8 operas in 1 year, which is an enormous amount of work. But with this technique, you can actually set them very quickly. So now, in the second half of tonight's program, we come to more familiar ground, and a chance, in fact, to celebrate some of Handel and Vivaldi's great stars. First, we'll hear an aria from Handel's Giustino of 1737, which is sung by the title character just after he rescues a princess from a wild animal. Very exciting. The title was created for the castrato Annibaldi, who actually we've in a way already met. He's part of this operatic jet set we've encountered. He, in fact, starred in Hasse's Cleofide when Hasse and his wife Faustina were brought to Dresden to open the opera house in 1731. Annibaldi was part of that cast. And Annibaldi would have been actually heard by J.S. Bach, because we know Bach came to the premiere of this opera. So again, it's this moment of worlds that we don't quite think of colliding, in fact, being very aware of each other. Bach knew perfectly well what was going on in the latest moves in opera style, and sometimes he reflects those in his music. We tend to think of him as a conservative or a very craft-oriented composer, but he also loved going to hear the operas in Dresden, apparently. A few years later, after Dresden, Annibaldi was actually lured to London to sing in Handel's season of 1736 and 37. He doesn't last much longer in London after that, but he made a great impression. Mrs. Pendarvis, one of the fans of Handel that writes so much about his performances, she wrote that Annibaldi had the best part of Senesino's voice and Caristini's, with a prodigious fine taste and good action. So it's very important that he not only sang well, but he had good taste, he knew how to ornament well, and he also looked really good on stage, and that's a great help in being a superstar. Another of Handel's great stars helped him to have his first big success in London with Rinaldo, his first opera in London in 1711. Niccolo Grimani, or Niccolini, was another Neapolitan kid who made the big time. By the time he was 25, he was working regularly at the great opera houses of Italy. He did over 36 opera productions in Naples and 34 opera productions in Venice. He worked an enormous amount. And he first comes to London in 1708, and he's one of these many foreigners, like Handel, who are lured to London by the sheer wealth of a city that was deeply devoted to the arts. And he ends up, like many, staying in London. He stays for nearly a decade and becomes a mainstay of many of Handel's productions. We'll also hear tonight, I've just lost the light, from a composer that we actually don't think of usually so much as an opera composer, and that's Antonio Vivaldi. And I think this is helpful to remember that actually Vivaldi would, I think, have preferred to be remembered as much as an opera composer as a violinist. The first thing we hear is from his opera Farnace, which he composed in 1727. It was a great success. It gets revived in Prague. Vivaldi develops this very close connection with Bohemian courts and the opera there. Interesting, the libretto is by a minor Italian poet. It's not a Metastasio text, but it does incorporate a few arias from Metastasio. It quotes Metastasio. And one of the arias that is included is Gelido in ogni vena, which is an aria from Siroe that we heard set earlier by Ferrandini in the first half. So this is a very nice way of comparing how two composers would set these texts. Very different. Vivaldi's setting is fabulously dramatic, and I think you'll find it strangely familiar. In fact, it's a version of the opening movement of his Winter from the Four Seasons. Vivaldi often recycled his hit tunes. The year before, he used for his opera Doria in Tempe, he turned the opening of the Spring Concerto from the Four Seasons into a wonderful chorus and aria, and a very unlikely thing. You would not expect a concerto to become an aria, but it does. There's also a way of remembering that the relation between instrumental virtuosity and vocal virtuosity is very close. So the passaggi of an aria to the passaggi of a concerto are very similar in what they're up to and the demands they put on the performer. Vivaldi was very closely involved with one theater in Venice, the Teatro Sant'Angelo. He had been working there from 1714. He had been teaching at the Pietà already for a decade before he takes on this opera work. But then this becomes one of his great focuses of his work in Venice. He claims to have written 90 operas. We think he probably only wrote 50. But they were more or less successful. He was considered a bit too modern for Venetian tastes. In fact, I strongly recommend Benedetto Marcello's wonderful parody of the opera scene in Venice called Teatro alla Moda, where he pokes a lot of fun at Vivaldi's excesses in writing. We'll hear tonight, to close the concert, an aria from Vivaldi's second opera at the Teatro Sant'Angelo. This was from his Orlando Finto Pazzo, or The Pretend Crazy Man. Unfortunately, the opera, which was written on libretto by the house poet, a guy named Grazio Braccioli, actually was not so successful. It only lasts a few weeks, and then the house isn't great, so Vivaldi actually replaces it with another Orlando opera. And again, I think it's a great sign of the extraordinary international range of this genre, that what he chose to replace it with was an opera from an Italian composer who was working in Dresden, not in Italy at all. So with this program, you get a real overview of all of these different people who were working in the field of opera seria, of how spectacular and how many varieties of languages could exist within this general style that we call the gallant today. And again, as I say, it's a style that is very, very, very much dependent on the performer. And you're in very safe hands with the extraordinary Philippe Jaroussky. This will be a chance really to hear an extraordinary performer doing the music that shows him at his best. So I hope you'll be enjoying the performance. Thank you so much.